Okay. So if anyone has not self-muted themselves, please do now, because it makes for the best audio recording. And I am going to tell you a little bit about our special guest. So welcome to the Mainline MUFON program for April. We have a special guest with us today. His name is John Ramirez, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about John's background. John Ramirez has served from 1984 to 2009 in the CIA as the Directorate of Science and Technology. He was additionally the Director of Intelligence and the Director of the ODNI, which is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And additionally, he was the Director of the National Counterproliferation Center. That stands for NCPC. During his 25-year career, he specialized in ballistic missile defense systems and signal analysis of weapon system radars. And this was all under a parent company that studied the UFO program for a very, very long time. Actually, the UFO program under the CIA continues to this day and was founded in 1947. And today, it is directed by the U.S. Air Force. They serve as the overseeing executive department that oversees this. He served as the chief of site for overseas technical collection. Excuse me, let me say that again. He served as a chief of a site for an oversized technical collection facility, and he was the executive of the Electronic Intelligence Analysis Branch. He's a founding member of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the NCPC. So you've been there since the founding of these institutions. And he was also a SIGINT specialist. And I will ask him to tell us what SIGINT stands for, and it's an abbreviation of SIGINT. So what's that department, John? What does that stand for?
Well, it stands for Signals Intelligence, or SIGINT.
Okay.
And I'll cover that in the briefing that I have in my briefing slides.
Thank
and I
you.
just want to amend something, that I was never the director of anything, these larger organizations. I worked in the directorate
Gotcha.
of these organizations. So thank you for the promotion.
Well,
They owe me money if I was the director.
Well, thanks for clarifying that
Absolutely.
for me, because it's sometimes hard to really understand someone's, bio and just read it as it's meant to be read. So in this SIGINT program, you worked with a multidisciplinary process of collection requirements as a strategist for the counterproliferation equities. I don't really understand exactly what that means, but I'm sure you're going to clarify that for us. And prior to his career in the intelligence community, John enlisted in the U.S. Navy as an electronics warfare technician. He is a graduate of George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and he's a member of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers and the Central Intelligence Retirees Association. So welcome so very much to Mainline MUFON, John. Thank you for coming and being willing to present a program. Everybody's giving you silent claps, as you can see.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm going to give you the floor and turn the program over for you, so you can share some of the visuals you have for us.
Okay, I will start the screen sharing and launch into my presentation.
Thanks, John. We can see it well, and you'll go to slide view. Yeah, slideshow.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Dome of Light phenomenon from the Cold War era to now. Now, this is very important. All statements of fact, opinion, and analysis expressed are those of the author, that's me, and do not reflect the official positions or views of the U.S. government. So what they're saying is that everything in my presentation, surprisingly, is unclassified. unclassified, but of course the government will not endorse what is in the presentation. So there's a little bit of separation between what you will be seeing and what I'll be talking about and the government's official views. This is another summary of my career. As I stated before, I was in the Directorate of Science and Technology. I was hired into the Office of Signals Intelligence Operations, which became the Office of Technical Collection. And then I was in the Directorate of Intelligence, which is now called the Director of Analysis, and the Office of Scientific and Weapons Research, which later became the Weapons Intelligence, Nonproliferation, and Arms Control Center. It's now called the Weapons and Counterproliferation Mission Center. Now that's a lot of words, but the key takeaway is that these two offices, OSWR and WINPAC, which became the Weapons and Counterproliferation Mission Center, when I was in CIA, these were the offices that held the legacy UFO programs since the time of Roswell. So I was in the right place at the right time, so to speak. And I ended my career in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the National Counterproliferation Center. And counterproliferation is the prevention of and the spread of biological, nuclear, and chemical weapons. And it's now called the National Counterproliferation and Biosecurity Center. So basically, that is a brief summary of my career. I retired as a GS-15, which is equivalent to a U.S. Army bird colonel. We're going to cover three areas: U.S. intelligence community, because it's really important to understand how and why and who manages UFOs within the government. And it's a lot of acronyms, but I think I'll explain it in a way that you can understand. And then we're going to go a little bit into the Roswell era, including some history. And now we're going into the modern UAP era. And so those are the three parts that we'll be covering in today's talk. Now, 9/11 established that the intelligence community could not be managed by one person. And that one person was called the Director of Central Intelligence. This office, the DCI, was created in 1946 after World War II and continued through 2004. Now, this person managed the entire US intelligence community, all the agencies and departments with intelligence components in the federal government, plus being the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So not only did this person run the CIA, but also ran the entire intelligence community, including the CIA. So that was a lot on that plate. And after 9/11, it was determined that it was too much on one person's plate. So they created the Director of National Intelligence, which was established in 2005, and of course is still in operation today. Now, sometimes there's overlapping authorities between the Department of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. And in US law, it's called Title 10 and Title 50. Title 10 refers to the armed services, the uniform armed services. So we have the Army, Navy, Air Force, and now we have the Marines under the Navy and Space Force under the Department of the Air Force. So that's Title 10. But we also have Title 50, which is the Department of Defense and the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Now, sometimes these overlapping authorities work well when they're cooperative, but also do not work well when they're competitive. And I see this when the UAP investigations and reports are reported out to, for example, Congress. Now, today, as we speak, tomorrow is Wednesday, and it will be the 19th of April, and that will be when there will be a second in the modern UAP era hearing before Congress, before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, which is chaired by Senator Gillibrand, Democrat of New York. And so the person speaking represents the Department of Defense and under Title 10, and some of it under Title 50. But if they were going to ask the ODNI to speak about it, then it'll be under Title 50 and it'll be a completely separate person. So all you're hearing tomorrow, it will be the DoD view of things, not necessarily the civilian intelligence community view of things. So that's why I mean by competitive and cooperative. So briefly, the ODNI has national centers. There's one for counterterrorism. I was in the National Counterproliferation Center, which then expanded into the National Counterproliferation and Biosecurity Center. And there's also the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. And those are the three big, huge components within the ODNI. And I believe there is now a cyber component to it. So there are 18 members of the intelligence community, but of the 18, 5 are the major big sisters of the intelligence community, and you know them well. Central Intelligence Agency, of course, was founded in 1947. It's called the agency. The National Security Agency is called the Fort, and we have the National Reconnaissance Office, and we actually call it Westfields because it's in the Westfields neighborhood or community of Chantilly, Virginia. And across the river in Anacostia, Maryland, we have the Defense Intelligence Agency, and we sometimes just call it bowling because it's that joint base bowling. And sometimes it's called the DIAC. And the most important of all 5 of these is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, or NGA, which was founded in 2003. We call it the Palace or the Crystal Palace. It has its roots during the Cold War as the National Photographic Interpretation Center. And in history, you know it as the folks who presented President Kennedy with the photographs of the evidence of Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba. So they're the guys that actually does imagery analysis. And why is this so important to UAPs? Well, that's because the NGA is the agency responsible for imagery analysis of everything on the Earth and the space above the Earth. It is the agency most likely to have collected and analyzed all of this UAP data. And why? Because UAP phenomena tends to be visual, like lights and orbs and crafts in the sky, and they are responsible to analyze the data from the sensors that take pictures of the lights, orbs, and craft in the sky. So this is a very important agency that doesn't get talked about enough in the UFO community. 5 disciplines in the intelligence community. One is human, and that's what you usually see in the movies. So anytime you see a spy movie involving CIA in a fictional sense, or read about it in a novel, it's a human intelligence. It's that discipline where a CIA officer will approach a person from a foreign country to convince that person to spy against his or her own country. And that's human intelligence. Open source intelligence is something we all use every day. If you go to Google and do a search, you're using open source intelligence, or looking up information about UAPs on a web page or YouTube videos. That's open source intelligence. OSINT was actually coined by CIA. I've heard the term back in 1980s, but now it's more popular to use by everyone. Signals intelligence is the specialty I was in. That's what NSA does. NSA collects signals, and from over the air, and also in the wire and wirelessly. So anything that's a signal that holds communications, that's NSA's responsibility. The hard one to understand is called MASIN, or Measurement and Signature Intelligence. And the best way I can describe it is it's everything that isn't any of the other 4. For example, radiation, that's MASIN, or radiance, something that glows, and you want to measure like how much energy is in that radiance, that's MASIN. And so, for example, at Skinwalker Ranch, when the government scientists went to Skinwalker Ranch and brought their instruments, the things that recorded the phenomenon at Skinwalker Ranch was under the MASIN discipline. And finally, geospatial intelligence, again, that's what NGA does, of looking at intelligence of photographs taken from space on the Earth, and also above space, above the Earth. The NRO you probably heard of, they build satellites and they enabled all of these other 5 disciplines to happen. So they build the space-based sensors, and they also support the data collection of these sensors to make sure that the other 5 disciplines are able to get the data they need to do their jobs. Another facet of the intelligence community are the science and technology intelligence centers. Now, some of these you probably already know. One is the Missile and Space Intelligence Center called MISIC, M-I-S-I-C, MISIC. Now, the current head of ARROW, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the person that will testify tomorrow is Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, and he was the chief scientist in this Missile and Space Intelligence Center at Huntsville, Alabama. We also have the National Ground Intelligence Center in Charlottesville, Virginia, and they are responsible for ground and underground weapons and facilities. Now, we know that a lot of these UAPs are what we call transmedium, that they can fly in the sky, fly in space, and they've been seen to go into the water. When they go into the water, that's the Navy's responsibility. And that center is called the National Maritime Intelligence Center, located in Sweetland, Maryland. So they just do undersea weapons and facilities. The new one is NSIC, National Space Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So they do space weapons and what we know as space intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Now, why is that important? Well, you probably heard about these triangles that people see. They might be used to collect intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and those kinds of missions. And so who's responsible for that? That would be the National Space Intelligence Center. Anything that flies in the air or up in space that collects intelligence for the military, that's under the purview of NSIC. Now, the famous one is the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, or NASIC. Back during the Roswell period, it was known as the Army Material Command T2 Intelligence. And this is also located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And this allegedly is the place where the materials from the Roswell crash went to. And I can say this, excuse me, that after World War II, many of the weapons that were acquired from Germany also went to the Army Material Command T2 Intelligence at the time. So they were experts in what's known as foreign material acquisition and exploitation. So if you have something strange and you don't know what it is, how it works, what it's made of, NASIC back in the day when it was T2 Intelligence got that material. During the classic UFO period of 51 to 61, it was called the Air Intelligence Center. Most people know it as the Foreign Technology Division, or FTD. That comes up in a lot of FOIA, and now it's NASIC. Now, here's where we get the division between Title 10, the Uniformed Services of the Pentagon, and Title 50, the Civilian Intelligence Community. And if you go down looking at this list, you'll see the same agencies, with one exception. The Central Intelligence Agency is an independent civilian agency. No one in the Pentagon controls the CIA, not the Secretary of Defense or anyone in the Pentagon. CIA is independent of the Pentagon. So when the CIA has the UFO portfolio, the legacy UFO portfolio, it can do it without any interference from the Pentagon. However, I would say this, that CIA may have reached out to the Pentagon for assistance and support. That is to say that the Air Force may have provided program executive office services to the CIA in managing this UFO portfolio. And the DoD side, these intelligence agencies are called combat support agencies for the warfighter customers, whereas on the ODNI side, they're collection, analysis, and production agencies to support the policymakers in making their decisions. Now, you heard national security and national defense. People use those interchangeably, but from the inside, we know them to be very different. So national defense is war fighting. It's like military preparedness and training, fighting and winning wars. We're projecting power, global strike. We have alliances with foreign militaries, and we monitor threats and deter, disrupt, and mitigate those threats. And the IC side, it's much more extensive. Indications and warnings of imminent threats is probably the most important reason why the IC exists. And that is the reason that the IC was stood up after Pearl Harbor, because there was a surprise attack, and the indications and warning did not reach the policymakers in a timely fashion. And of course, you can argue that 9/11, those indications and warnings did not reach the policymakers in a timely fashion as well. There's also threats posed by state and non-state terrorism, WMD, technological surprise. Also, what do foreign governments think about things? What are their strategic plans, policies, intentions? If you recall, just from recently, the leaks of documents by this one individual in the Air National Guard, a lot of that information that he leaked contain our knowledge of foreign government plans, policies, and intentions, which is very, very, very sensitive, especially any intention to influence or manipulate global information by these governments. And some of the most important work we do is human trafficking. We keep track of like where these illicit types of networks are operating in order to shut them down. We also look at illicit financial transactions. Follow the money, and if you have wrongdoing, you will find it through following the money. We look at refugee flows, we look at climate change, we look at water resources, just everything to do with the earth, and nothing to do with like military or intelligence, but things related to the health of the earth. That's part of national security. So you might get the idea that the DoD, the Pentagon, is driven by a national defense viewpoint. So when they look at UAPs, they're wondering, are they weapons? Are they threats? And also, can this technology be exploited as a military advantage? Now let's look at the what ALSAP and ATIP stood for. The W in ALSAP stood for weapon, and the T in ATIP stood for threat. Now, threat doesn't imply that it's active hostile intent. It's more about technological surprise, indications and warning of possible hostile intent. So the threat posed by something, once the threat is in action, well, it's more than a threat. It's like hostile intent. It's like the threat of bad weather, and then it rains. The threat of bad weather is far gone. It's already bad weather. So you can use that analogy to think of the word threat when you hear it bandied about by various members of the Department of Defense. So CIA is driven completely by a national security viewpoint. What and who are they? Where did they come from? Why are they here? And how do they work? To me, these are more important questions. Why are they here? Probably the most important of them all. You might have heard of a weird desk at CIA. And what the weird desk did was look into paranormal and metaphysical research. You can read it there: telekinesis, psychoenergetics, remote viewing, which you've heard of. But most importantly, the expansion of human consciousness and advancement of human potential. That was part of it as well. Now, if you heard about certain documents surfacing that talked about the gateway process at the Monroe Institute, and that this was held in the CIA archives, well, this is part of the interest in expanding human consciousness and advancing human potential. Now, I worked in two of these offices you see listed. Let's go back to the Roswell era. There was once a Central Intelligence Group, and in 1947, it became the Central Intelligence Agency. Within it, there was the Office of Reports and Estimates, which existed between 46 and 49. And that was the office that had the UFO portfolio from Roswell. Inside that office was a scientific intelligence branch. Now, that branch was expanded in 1949 to be its own office called the Office of Scientific Intelligence. Now, you may have heard of Office of Scientific Intelligence if you're of a certain age and you watch television. There used to be a program called the $6 Million Man, starring the actor Lee Majors. And in this program, the $6 Million Man, he was constructed, that is, he was engineered, both human and mechanical parts, by this Office of Scientific Intelligence. And so that was actually out in the entertainment industry, there was such an office. The Office of Technical Services, I highlighted in bold because it's still present. This office, its predecessor, was where the MK Ultra program resided. And then there was the Office of Research and Development. And within the Office of Research and Development, there were vestiges of the remote viewing program in that office. Office of Chief Scientist is important because they are looking at the UAP issue from CIA's scientific and technical perspective. Now, the actual program, that is the actual study of the program, the research, when I was at CIA, was done by the Office of Scientific and Weapons Research, which existed from 1980 to 2001. This was a reorganization of the original Office of Scientific Intelligence. So in 1980, the Office of Scientific Intelligence added more parts, became Scientific and Weapons Research. And in 2001, after 9/11, it became the Weapons Intelligence Non-Proliferation Arms Control Center, which existed until 2016. Today, right now, since 2016, the Weapons and Counterproliferation Mission Center is where the UAP program resides right this minute as I speak. It's still there, and it's never left since 1947. And again, this is separate from Blue Book. You heard about Blue Book. That was the Air Force. That was Title 10. This is Title 50, the civilian intelligence community. We never stopped looking at the UFO UAP issue. Now let's go to the Cold War I era, which I call it, because I think we're in Cold War II, with the Roswell era. Now, you've heard about paperclip. In May of 1945, immediately after Germany surrendered, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was created, and they collected and analyzed Nazi archives, located Nazi scientists, and what's not known very well in the history, that the US Army was assisted by Nazi party officials and SS officers. And then during the Nuremberg trials, Waffen SS soldiers guarded their former masters, the heads of the Nazi party that were tried at Nuremberg. They were given American uniforms. In 1945, July 1945, and keep in mind that this was, at the time of Trinity, the first explosion of a nuclear device by the United States in New Mexico. In July 1945, it was recommended that certain Nazi scientists with information about technology, the advanced technology that the Germans were working on, should be resettled by the United States, because the Soviet Union was grabbing them as fast as they could. So we wanted to step in and kind of repatriate these scientists for the United States. It was originally called Operation Overcast, but we now know it as Paperclip. Now, we think of Paperclip as Dr. Werner von Braun, and rocket scientist, but the Nazis, that is the philosophical Nazis who can trace their interest back to the Thule Society, and they were obsessed with these ancient bloodlines and hybridization. And so it's speculation that these German scientists revealed the existence of a human hybrid breakaway civilization, and that this civilization made contact with these German scientists because they reached out to find them, that they provide some advanced technology information. And were some of these documents recovered by the Americans have any kind of clue into a research into superior civilizations of ancient origin? And Basically, we're talking about Atlantis. And so on the right side, I have examples of what you've probably seen before, particularly the Glocke and the Horton HO229, which actually, if you see pictures of Kenneth Arnold holding up the actual crafts that he saw from his aircraft, they were more shaped like the Horton HO229, but the press reported it as flying saucers, and that kind of stuck into the public mind. But what he drew looked more like that picture below of the Horton 229, which, by the way, doesn't that look like every stealth aircraft the U.S. has ever built? There was a group called the Deutsches Anonymity, which went out to investigate the occult origins of the German people. And they actually reached out to like Tibet. They went to Latin America. They went into Antarctica. They were looking for any kind of artifacts, or they launched archaeological expeditions. They were also steeped into occult practices and psychic phenomena, and unfortunately, human genetic experiments that occurred in the concentration camps, because they were very interested in the human genome, which they didn't know too much about, but neither did anyone else. But the DNA, the existence of DNA actually was discovered in the 1860s. Only the sequencing of that genome occurred in the 1990s. But there was knowledge of DNA even back then. So imagine President Truman receiving all of this information from, quote unquote, our Nazis, the Americans who rescued these Nazis to work on American defense programs. Imagine that. And so you're 1946, you know the Russians are spying against you, and you know that you have this information, you need to protect it. Well, President Truman in January 1946 created the National Intelligence Authority. And within the Intelligence Authority, created in 46, he created the Central Intelligence Group, which was the immediate precursor to the CIA. And it was the successor to the World War II Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. Its purpose, the CIG's purpose, was to safeguard the secret association between the US government and these former Nazis. We just defeated Germany, and we were like trying some of their leaders. So it was extremely, extremely sensitive, a top secret that we actually brought these Nazis over immediately after World War II. And so the creation of the National Intelligence Authority gave birth to what Richard Dolan calls the national security state. So that's of the 1,600 Nazis that were brought over under the paperclip program, 600 were actual rocket scientists, 1,000 worked for CIA and were recruited into the CIA and then sent back into Europe to be intelligence officers spying for the US. And probably the most famous of them all is Richard Reinhard Gehlen, who actually stood up the West German Intelligence Service. Now, going to Roswell, it occurred on July the 2nd, 1947. And how do we know that? Is because the article on July the 8th, 1947, which announced that the Roswell base captured a flying saucer, it alluded to the Mr. and Mrs. Wilmot having witnessed a large glowing object zooming across the sky a week prior on July the 2nd. And they described it very much like we would describe an orb. Glowed as though the light was showing from the inside, not the outside. And it was going at, they estimated 400 to 500 miles per hour, 1,500 feet high, and in 40 to 50 seconds, it was gone. It made no sound, but Mrs. Wilmot heard a swishing sound. Now, it was only like in July 8th of 1947 that the actual newspaper article, the famous one in the Roswell Daily Record, appeared. And it's interesting that it actually probably disclosed the only time the US government at the time told the truth that they captured a saucer, it's a craft. It was not a weather balloon. So now we have July 26, 47. CIA was created by law, and the Department of Defense was not created in 1947. It was called the National Military Establishment. And the National Military Establishment was later renamed the Department of Defense in 1949. Now, between 47 and 49, something very interesting occurred. In May of 1948, the Armed Services Procurement Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Truman. And what did this act contain? Well, it provided an exception for the fledgling defense contractor agencies to procure services and property without competing for them. That is, they didn't have to compete with another company and then have the government pick the best bid. The government was allowed through this act to handpick a defense contractor without any competition whatsoever and enable a sole source contract with them. That is, they and only they, that company, will receive money to do the work, no one else. And not only that, that the work they produce need not be advertised. It can be kept hidden. So this was the birth of the black budget programs. It greatly influenced the defense contractors' power and influence. And it was in 1948 that the military industrial complex was born. And of course, that phrase was coined by President Eisenhower as he was leaving office as president. But the actual birth of it occurred in 1948 through this act. So having black budgets is nothing new. It's been going on for decades, a year after the time of Roswell. This is something very interesting. Now, you may have heard the CIA is part of the truth embargo about denying the existence of UFOs, yet the CIA released on its own website 10 recommendations of how to properly investigate a UFO. And if so, you as MUFON members would recognize these 10 steps that the CIA recommended. Here's the way to investigate a UFO properly. And they used the Lonnie Zamora incident that occurred in 1964 as, here's the example of the way to do it right. And so you can read those for yourself, but isn't it interesting that the agency that is associated with disinformation about UFOs would turn around and say, well, this is how you investigate them. Now, let's get on to the actual Dome of Light incident. It occurred in Petrozavodsk, Russia, and there's a map of where Petrozavodsk is. And it's near the border of Finland, northeast of what is today St. Petersburg. Here's what was seen. So the United Press International cited a TASS being the Soviet news agency during the Cold War, a TASS report of a sighting by Petrozavodsk dock workers of a huge star-like ball of light flashing out of the sky. And they estimate 4 a.m. on September the 20th, 1977. Now, this ball of light also shape-shifted into a jellyfish and slowly hovered over the city, sending out numerous thin rays of light. And then this jellyfish shape again shifted into a shroud, into the clouds, into a glowing red object. Now, if you think about orbs that people see, people have recorded and witnessed these glowing red objects, which we now call orbs. It was seen for about 10 to 12 minutes by these dock workers. It was also visible in Helsinki, Finland for about 4 minutes. And there were eyewitnesses, including the TASS news agency reporter. There was an ambulance crew, sailors, and police officers who said, yes, we saw this. Now, James Oberg, who worked for NASA as an engineer, he doesn't believe any of this. He believes it was part of a Soviet weapon system called the fractional orbital bombardment system. And let me make that very simple for you. It's basically a ballistic missile flown as a cruise missile. It was the Soviet Union's early attempt at a hypersonic velocity missile. And so they tested it throughout the Cold War and last tested it in 1971. And they stopped testing it because back then it didn't work. So this FOBS or FOBS system was stopped 6 years prior to seeing this Petrov-Zavadovsk phenomenon. So this association with this secret weapon system and what was seen by these dock workers does not have a correlation. So a study by Soviet scientists and us, the US intelligence community, they observed that these domes seem to have some association with a class of missiles called the IRBMs, or intermediate range ballistic missiles, particularly the SS-20 Sabre, which the Russians call the RSD-10. This was a missile that was of a great threat to NATO because it did not reach the United States, but it could reach every country in NATO. And so when they were testing these missiles, without a nuclear warhead, by the way, but still testing these missiles, the Soviet scientists and the Soviet military discovered that this phenomenon was interfering with the test. Now, let's step back a moment. And we've all heard about the Maelstrom incident, where there may have been sightings of a phenomenon that interfered with the launch status of these operational US ballistic missiles in their silos. And so, as you remember, Robert Salas has briefed about this in many of his presentations. He was there when it happened. And so here's an instance of the Russians experiencing the same thing. They're going to test this ballistic missile, which was to carry nuclear warheads, 3 of them, as a matter of fact. And yet, what happened was that there was interference with these tests, that these little domes of light would accompany these missiles and interfere with it. Now, the analysts at the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base believe that these domes of light was actually just a countermeasure by the Soviet Union to hide a nuclear missile attack. So, okay, they put up these domes of light, and then we can't tell which is the real missile and which is the dome of light. So that's what the Department of Defense thought these domes of light were. In the Los Angeles Times, January 24, 1988, the late Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina was the first to actually say dome of light, masking a nuclear first strike. So we know as domes of light because of what Senator Helms released in the public domain from the briefings he had received at the time. In Russia, these domes of light are treated as UAPs because they know that they didn't do it, and we know that we didn't do it, and so they look at these as UAPs. Now, to be fair, I would have to say that when you launch a missile or a rocket, there's something called a plume that is generated by the exhaust of the main engine. And this plume could look like a dome. And on the top right corner of the slide, you'll see a plume, an ICBM dome of light, a plume caused by the Topo-M ballistic missile. Now, the first Topo-M was tested 8 years before the first test launch. So the Petrov-Zavadovsk phenomenon happened, people witnessed it, and 8 years later, they tested this missile with this dome. So what they saw in 1977 was not a dome associated with a ballistic missile test. More recently, Russia has perfected their hypersonic glide vehicle, which can carry a 2 megaton warhead, and it can fly at Mach 27. And when it flies that fast in near space, it creates this kind of aura around it, a glow around it, which you see illustrated. This is an actual illustration from the Russian Ministry of Defense. And so that kind of plasma envelope will accompany the hypersonic glide vehicle as it skirts the near space, between space and the actual atmosphere. A Russian cosmonaut trainer named Timofey Egorov appeared on Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure 2.0, celebrating the 20th anniversary of the original disclosure event at the National Press Club. And in his appearance, he did state, yes, the Petrozavodsk phenomenon are considered by Russia to be UAP events. Now, what did we collect? Well, we have several aircraft that fly for the US Air Force collecting intelligence. What you see pictured on the upper right corner of the slide is called Cobra Ball. And the Cobra Ball aircraft contains special sensors, including a camera, which was designed to record the Russian missiles re-entering into the atmosphere over the Kamchatka Peninsula in the far eastern Soviet Union, now Russia. So if you remember, there was a tragic incident of a South Korean airliner being shot down by a Russian fighter. The Russian fighter allegedly mistook the airliner, commercial airliner with passengers as this US Air Force plane, and it thought it shot down the US Air Force plane, which overflew Kamchatka. There was a pilot back then who is now a PhD military aviation historian by the name of Robert Hopkins. And he confirmed that there was official US interest in the Dome Light phenomenon, which was validated by subsequent FOIA. And his aircraft collected infrared and telemetry signals from missile tests. That's what the job was of the Cobra Ball aircraft. Now, what he saw, he described as a translucent milky white wall of light covering from ground as far into the sky as he could see out of his cockpit window. And this wall of light radiated at 6,200 miles per hour. And still, the analysts back at good old FTD believed that this phenomenon was a ballistic missile defense countermeasure. They could not grasp their minds around the fact that it could be some high strangeness going on and not anything that the Russians were doing. Now, here's something that is also of interest because I found an open source in a journal published by the Germans. They interviewed a former Soviet Air Force Major General by the name of Vasily Alexeyev. And in this 1997 interview held at the Moscow Space Communications Center, he revealed that, yes, these events occurred when the missiles carried special, quote unquote, military loads. The word special meaning nuclear or nuclear, inert nuclear military loads. Now, here come these UAPs, known as domes of light, and that the Soviet leadership determined to make contact with this phenomenon. And they instructed the military to use devices such as radar stations and a theodolite, which, if you understand surveying, you know it's a telescope with a laser attached to it. They use very sophisticated ones as part of their missile tests to be able to track these missiles coming into their test ranges to try to track this phenomenon. And they were able to record all of this instrumented data for later analysis. Now, according to Major General Vasily Alexeyev, the contact was successful and they were able to interact, that is, the Russian military on the ground was able to interact with this phenomenon. It would like come down low enough to the ground and it actually oriented itself by whatever gestures the humans on the ground made. So it came down, for example, as a ball, and then if the humans would outstretch their arms, it flattened out to a disc. If the humans would like twist their bodies and arms over to the left, this object maneuvered and tilted over to its left. So that reminds me of some of the scenes in the very final part of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when the craft landed on top of Devil's Tower, that there was some kind of interaction with the humans on the ground. And here the Russians admitted that, according to this Major General, that yes, we were able to contact them. Now, where this occurred was the Sarashigan Missile Test Center, which is their counterpart to Area 51 and White Sands Missile Range. The radars that were able to track this UAP phenomenon, one of them was the Sarashigan Neiman P Space Research Radar, which was used to study anomalous phenomena. And there is a picture of it on the ground of this radar, highly sophisticated. And also for ballistic missile early warning, the Russians at the time deployed what is known as the Daryal radar, which were huge radars ringing the periphery of the Soviet Union and now Russia. And so the transmitter building is on the left, and you see the taller receiver building on the right. To give you a perspective, that receiver building is 20 stories high. The Russians do not do anything small. When they do something, they do it big. And it may be like not very sophisticated, but by golly, their stuff works. Now, this slide is one that I thought would get redacted by CIA, but they passed it as unclassified. Now, one thing that, to preface this, we had facilities in Iran under the Shah to collect intelligence from the Soviet Union. They were up in the mountains of northern mountains of Iran, and they had a good view of some of the missile tests the Soviets were conducting. We lost those facilities when the Islamic Republic of Iran came into power. And so we now place these facilities to monitor the Soviet missile tests. We approached the Chinese government. Yes, not Taiwan. We're talking about the People's Republic of China, the Communist Chinese Party, Beijing. We approached them to see if they're willing to host CIA facilities in their country. And you know what? They said yes. Yes, we will. And the senator from the Foreign Relations Committee at the time went over there to do the final brokering of the deal, now sits in the White House. President Joe Biden, when he was Senator of Delaware, sitting on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, he went over there and brokered that deal with the Chinese. And so I posted on this slide some of the open source that you can then look up for yourself to read all about it. So this really did happen, and CIA did not redact it because I cited open sources, including the open source of a former director of Central Intelligence, Bob Gates. He wrote about the fact that China was the host for these new facilities by CIA. Now, one of the sensors we placed at the facility was able to collect infrared data. That's about as much as I can say. And it was around about 87, 88. And so here, the Chinese knew about the domes of light, that we placed this so that we can collect these unusual infrared phenomena. And I believe they were briefed because in 1988, the Chinese government established the China UFO Society, which is China's equivalent of MUFON, but it's under the official auspices of the Communist Chinese Party. And so in 1992, they celebrate their 4th anniversary. So you do the math, and it coincides with the fact that some of these special sensors were placed in these joint facilities. And there is the reference in the CIA reading room about the China UFO Society. And so in China, they take a different approach. They look at it as serious. Scientific attitude will contribute to the development of science as well as maintaining social stability, whatever that means. But there was no stigma in China to look at the UAP phenomena. Okay, so now we're at the UAP era of the Cold War II. And I want to describe a hypothetical case of a UAP event. So back in 1947, as we know, the DoD and the intelligence community did not really exist as it does today. There was the Department of War, which had a counterintelligence corps known as G2, and there was the Department of the Navy. And the Office of Naval Intelligence has existed since 1882. And that was it. Department of War and Department of Navy. Now, how about today? How would today's intelligence community respond to an unusual detection of a phenomenon above the Earth, which, by the way, has occurred many times? So here's the hypothetical scenario. Remember the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Their analysts discovered numerous light orbs under intelligent control in their frames of imagery that they're analyzing. Okay, so how would everything respond? Well, the intelligence community analysts will first rule out adversary technology. Could this be Chinese? Could this be Russian? Here's where I come in. My branch, the Electronic Intelligence Analysis branch, was given that job of finding out whether it was Soviet aircraft that may have carried advanced technology like a plasma stealth generator. That is a generator that created a plasma cloud around the aircraft in order to obscure it. Could it be that technology? And we knew that there was a MiG-31 Foxhound that could fly up to 123,000 feet and stay there for briefly, but could fly in a combat mode between 85 to 100,000 feet. That aircraft was designed to shoot down American high-flying bombers and the SR-71, which is why the SR-71 was grounded and never flew again, because they had something to shoot it down. We could not overfly Russian territory anymore. So we ruled that out. It couldn't have been them. Now it must have been, like, for example, software on the ground, software to process these images. Everything was working within specifications. Now let's look at the spacecraft in space. Could there have been a glitch in spacecraft? No, they were working fine as well. So we ruled out all of the plausible explanations for these light orbs that we're seeing by the intelligence community. So now they establish a working group to do a deep dive into the phenomenon. So the DNI will establish a compartment to control the dissemination. And NGA, as the agency that had the data originally, becomes the lead agency and would brief the other agencies, which in turn will establish their own internal working groups to read in their own subject matter experts. Then they will reach out to the contractors, and you know these well: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, the four major ones, and read them in. And then we will have a community working group meeting, inviting all of the concerned parties into studying this phenomenon, whereupon more collection is tasked and an objective is reached as the consensus of what's going on, and they will write a report for the Director of National Intelligence. And I can tell you that this actually happened, and where NGA met was NGA West, which is located in St. Louis, Missouri. So if you go to St. Louis, Missouri, there is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency West. They're building a brand new big headquarters there and outside of Washington, and a lot of imagery work happens there in St. Louis, Missouri. So that's where they went back in the day. It was about 2004 timeframe. Remember, ALSAP started in 2007 when Senator Reid sponsored the acquisition funds for ALSAP. So this was before ALSAP. And remember what I said, that the civilian intelligence community led by CIA has been involved in UFO UAP research since Roswell. So this was an extension of that research. So the DNI will brief the President of the United States. And so I need to describe what a decision lever is. A lever is sort of like, as you remember in the old slot machines in Las Vegas, something you pull to watch the fruit go around, and maybe you hit the jackpot. So think of it as a decision lever that we give the president like decision levers to pull. And when he pulls one, some kind of outcome will happen. And it's our job, the intelligence community, to provide the president with the intended and unintended consequences of making a decision. That's what we do. That's the only job number one, that what we do is support the president in making decisions. So a decision level one might be to observe, but continue active data collection and analysis. Just watch them. Let's collect data. Number two might be to engage the phenomenon, but not threaten it. That is, trying to get close to it. And number three is to shoot the darn thing down, engage the phenomenon, provoke a reaction from it. And so we collect a lot of data, so much data. There's a lot of data. And Sue Gordon, who was the principal deputy director of national intelligence in the beginning of the Trump administration, she said, there's so much data. And so why can't anyone make sense of it all? And I think the answer is because there's so much of it to begin with. And now the intelligence community is looking at artificial intelligence to go through that data, to try to make sense and have the human then select what might be plausible from the data that's collected. Now, we're almost at the end. So that's what's happening right now. And so you hear a briefing from Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who is head of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, chaired by Senator Gillibrand of New York. So I don't know what he's going to say tomorrow, but I would not expect any kind of disclosure. I expect more bean counting. And they're going to talk about resources, staffing. Do you have the money to do your job? Do you have the staff to do your job? And oh, by the way, what is your number now? What is your count? How many of these things have you collected? How many of them do you know about? And nothing about what are they? Who are they? Where did they come from? Why are they here? That would not get discussed in an open hearing before Congress. So don't expect that. But let's go back in history. Here's the first director of Central Intelligence. Well, not the first director of Central Intelligence, the first director of Central Intelligence Agency, who also was director of Central Intelligence, managing the entire nascent intelligence community back then, from 47 to 50. And he said to the New York Times, "It is time for the truth to be brought out in open congressional hearings." This is 1960, mind you. But through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. To hide the facts, the Air Force has silenced its personnel. What has changed since then? Nothing. This is what we're facing today. And now we're opening up a little bit, letting a little bit more light be brought in. But here's the first guy who ran my agency, the CIA, and he's disclosing a lot in there about the reality of what we're seeing. These flying objects are not nonsense, and it's time for the truth to be brought out. Here's another director of Central Intelligence, Ambassador Woolsey, who served from 93 to 95 during the Clinton administration. And he recounts that he had a friend who's a private pilot, and his aircraft stopped in midair 40,000 feet in the presence when he encountered a UAP, just stopped. And he knows that a lot of this has been happening. And we need to start examining what's going on, because he knows what's going on, but he didn't say at this particular Black Vault event with John Greenwald. And then there's Director of Central Intelligence Agency, John Brennan, during the Obama administration. And so he actually says, well, it's some phenomena we don't understand yet. It involves some activity that constitutes a different form of life. And this guy knows what's going on. He knows what's going on. So you see now that there are a little bit more hints being dropped, a little more breadcrumbs that are actually turning into a full loaf of bread. Now, this is the DNI during the Trump administration. And now he's the one that said, there was a lot of sightings that haven't been made public at all. These objects, they've been seen by Navy and Air Force pilots, picked up by satellite imagery, and engage in actions are difficult to explain. That is, the actions, what Lou Elizondo calls the 5 observables of these UAPs. So again, John Radcliffe knows what's going on, and he's giving up more information. And so I would say, as I said, that the hearings may not disclose much of anything. And if you expect these earth-shattering statements to be made by Dr. Kirkpatrick, that's not going to happen. But I endorse what Mr. Stephen Bassett has been saying. Steve Bassett has said that disclosure will happen in months, not years, months. And so I talked to him just recently at the UFO conference in San Francisco. And I told him that I endorsed his statement, that I believe he is right, that it will happen in months, not years. Finally, our current DNI, Avril Haines, she says, is there something else that we simply do not understand that might come extraterrestrially? Finally, the ET word spoken by the leader of the entire US intelligence community. So stay tuned. And as I do, I embrace everything widely. That is, I don't like to reject anything outright because I don't want to have or hold any biases, but I will embrace it, but I'm going to hold it lightly. And if it doesn't pan out, I'll drop it. And if something does pan out, I'll hold it more tightly. And that's the way I operate. And I thank you very much. And I'll return control back to Jennifer here in a minute. There we go.
Wow, John, you've just really dropped a lot of breadcrumbs for us. We have about 23 people online with us tonight, and I know many of them are going to want to ask some questions. I really appreciate you going into detail about, the Russian interactions with some UAPs, and gosh, I never knew we had a CIA base in China to spy on the Russians. I mean, that's all really, really fascinating, but I am going to turn the floor over to Fred first, who has his professional hand raised in Zoom right away. He is the state director for MUFON in Minnesota, I believe. And then
yeah, I'm the assistant state director for Nebraska, and I'm part of the ERT team as well. So John, I did see you on Gaia TV with Emery Smith. I really enjoyed that program. That was excellent. I enjoyed hearing about your encounters and your ET excursions, let's say.
Okay.
Here's an interesting little factoid for you, John. I used to work on the Cobra Ball RC-135 or
Yes.
aircraft out on
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's at Shimia, right?
Oh,
at
Shimia
the time.
Yeah.
Well, it was at Shimia back in 1983 when I worked on it.
Okay.
And then so I was aware of your Cobra Ball, Cobra Dane, and then Cobra Judy.
Cobra Judy. Yeah.
It's just the Navy ship.
Right.
So I worked 37 years alongside Cobra Ball for a couple of years, and the rest of it was the RC-135, and I worked that. So that was part of the electronic warfare or the SIGINT,
Combat,
as you say.
combat sent rivet joint.
Right, exactly. So I worked
I've been on all board. I never flew on them, but I was inside them.
Cool.
Inside Cobra Ball, saw the RTOS, the real-time optical system. And I was on board Cobra Judy, the only ship in the Air Force.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I was a part of that fiasco. For what I was interested in, though, too, John, you talked about Hitler back in the day and going into the possible secret space program that back in those days. What was that? Was that something with Admiral Byrd that kind of flew out of Antarctica that they were found out if there was some sort of spacecraft or alien technology back in those days of ET origin?
That's a very elusive to trace down. I do know that the association with the SS Nazis, and CIA is still extremely sensitive. And I got some feedback from some CIA folks that they did not like my association of UFOs, Nazis, and the CIA. And so I thank them very much for confirming my suspicions, because if they didn't have any problems, they wouldn't say anything. But I often wondered about the Admiral Byrd expedition. What is it called? High something? I forget.
High jump.
High jump. Thank you very much. And what all of that entailed. I will say this. I happen to know that NORAD has tracked these craft coming out of the Arctic Circle and into Antarctica. And I will say that much. And I can't prove it because I just can't prove it. But I know that much, that these craft have been seen over the poles, and that the U.S. Space Force is now building a constellation of satellites for the polar regions.
Oh,
And so take a look at the poles, particularly the Arctic. They're looking at things flying out of the Arctic Circle. And so they want persistent coverage. And that's being managed. The other component that's important in all of this sensory data from the Department of Defense side is it's called U.S. Space Force Delta 4, Del 4. They're responsible for the infrared constellation. And it's at a base called Buckley Space Force Base in Aurora, Colorado.
oh
And so
wow.
sometimes that word Aurora gets bandied about, but Aurora, Colorado is home base for the entire U.S. technical intelligence community. Everything goes to Aurora, Colorado, first and foremost, from Menwith Hill, UK, where we have a base there with the British General Communications Headquarters, the British equivalent of NSA, and our facility, the CIA facility in Alice Springs, Australia, Pine Gap. And we run that facility with the Australian Signals Directorate. And all of that information is collated and distributed out of Aurora, Colorado. And that's where they place the sensory data for all of this infrared imagery.
Yeah. I would just have to say that when I was working the RC, they did encounter a couple orbs off the wingtip, and when the crew landed, they all had to sign sign the sheet and say they would not say anything about their sighting. And
right, yeah, I interface with, I think it was Rivet Joint.
Right.
Yeah, Rivet Joint people. And I interface with them. Paul Murad. I don't know if you know the name Paul Murad. Paul A.
No, I don't.
Murad. He retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he entered into the advanced propulsion field from the Defense Intelligence Agency. And he and I were working anomalous signature collections by Rivet Joint.
Yeah. Well, on the Cobra Ball, I used to do digital analysis there, and then I also would take the data and record it, and then ship what they collected on the Cobra Ball and ship it down to NSA. Boys, back in those days.
Yep, thank you very much, because I spun those tapes in my lab.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, they collected telemetry as well, and they collected some of the signals. I had a Kamchatka, and so thank you very much for sending those over.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think about the real SSP or secret space program that some of the folks think they've been a part of?
I would say that and I'll make this my last answer, because I know other hands are have been raised. I would say this: I have a hard time believing that the secret space program would need to draft citizens, ordinary citizens, for involuntary servitude when the Department of Defense has trained space aviators ready and willing to go. And so I'm not denying that there is a secret space program. I'm just saying I find it hard to believe that somebody would be kidnapped, quote unquote, to serve in a secret space program when we have people in uniform who are trained to do that. And I'll leave it at that, because I can't say about it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to call on John Burdies, who's also been a member of MUFON. I'm not quite sure if you still are or not. You were a state director as well, correct? Or an associate state director?
I'm a state section director and still an FI, though I don't do much of MUFON anymore. I'm not real happy with them. I resigned from the ERT for moral reasons, along with many other senior members. And what I noticed, and this is a question that John might be able to throw some light on. What I noticed was back in early 2022, when the big uproar was going on with the ERT, between ERT and MUFON, I was apparently one of the more vocal people that had objections to releasing data, collecting data from experiencers, and was clearly targeted by some three-letter agencies of some sort. They were signaling quite clearly through phone interference, email interference, people climbing up my telephone poles, people recording me, people sending me weird emails. I just recently talked to someone on Sunday at length about the whole issue. And again, my MADAR unit, which never goes off, went off 4 times an hour afterwards. It never goes off. I'm taking it as clear signals from some 3-letter agency. And I wondered, I'm not going to shut up, but I wondered if you had any comments on that. And I also wanted to say, Jennifer, thank you for inviting me to this. I have a great deal of respect for John Ramirez and what he does. I saw you in Phoenix and I caught you in the hallway. I said, have you written a book? And you said,
No.
no, but
No.
my God, you need to write something. Talking and these individually here and there is one thing, but if you could get a book out, you have so much knowledge. So anyway, if you have some comments about interfering, I think personally what's going on is there's a kind of a space race going on between our and the Chinese and maybe the Russian intelligence agencies to get the first bits of info from experiencers as to alien technology, and don't interfere with it, by God, or you'll be messed with. What are your thoughts?
Yes, and I don't know too much about the MUFON organization or ERT or any of that. I'll address the general question about MUFON, and I'll put it this way. You might know the name Dr. James Lakatsky. He wrote a book. He is a Defense Intelligence Agency officer who wrote a book with Colm Kelleher and George Knapp called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. So
Yes.
He wrote that book, right? And
Yes.
in that book, if you read it carefully, he did attribute data collected from MUFON. So here's a DIA officer stating in the public domain in a book that they got data from MUFON. So
Well,
there's
in
that
the-
connection.
In the January MUFON journal, Dave McDonald clearly says that MUFON's been having a contractual relationship with the Defense Department for
Yes.
decades.
Yes.
For decades,
Mhm.
decades with an S.
Yes, and so there's that. Secondly, the Central Intelligence Agency is not allowed by law to approach citizens of the United States unless that citizen approaches it first. So we don't go out and spy on people who are United States citizens or even U.S. persons defined as anyone within the 50 states or territories of the United States. We're not allowed to do that. If they come to us, we'll talk to them. And that's how we recruit people, because, you know, I approach CIA as a citizen saying, I want to join up, and then they'll approach me. But however, there is something called the Department of Homeland Security, and they can approach citizens of the United States. And I would say that if there's a 3-letter agency associated with any of this, and the terms you use as interference, quote unquote, I would look to the the Department of Homeland Security. And again, going back to the book written by James Lukatsky, Skinwalkers of the Pentagon, he did state that one of the witnesses saw a license plate on a vehicle, wrote down the license plate, and then correlate that license plates to the Department of Homeland Security. So
I spoke to Daryl Sims in Pittsburgh
yeah,
at the conference last year.
yeah,
He actually, when I went to the buffet dinner at the end of the evening, he hollered out, "Hey, John, get your ass over here. We saved a seat for you." So I sat with him and I recounted a number of the things that had been happening, strange things. And he being former CIA and a CIA instructor even said, "Yep, they have their eye on you. They're signaling to you, and you're obviously picking up their messages." Yes, I am.
Yeah,
He said, if you don't listen, if you're not concerned about your own personal self, if you say, "I don't care what you do to me," then they'll move it to level 2, which will be, well, what about your family? What about your kids? Are you concerned about them?
right.
And it was a few weeks after I got an email from my daughter showing her exact location on Google Maps. And I emailed my daughter back and said, "Why did you send me this email with your location?" She said, "Dad, I didn't send you this email." So they've obviously moved it up to level 2.
Yeah, and I would again look to Department of Homeland Security.
Okay.
I would look to them. Daryl Sims, by the way, did he ever tell you what he did for CIA?
Other than being an instructor there, no.
Okay. He was in the Office of security officer. And he was not an intelligence analyst or not an operations officer. He was the Director of Administration, Office of Security. And so his instructions were based on, security instructor. He did not train operations officers in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. What are you indicating by that?
That he may not know exactly what CIA does because he wasn't there very long. He didn't have a long career at CIA.
Okay.
Yeah, but I like Daryl Sims, and he works with people I know.
He's a bit egotistical, but I think he's all right.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you might find that as a characteristic of many CIA officers. You might that, but I respect Daryl Sims, and I've been trying to reach out to him myself. I want to compare some notes with him as well, and so I have a go-between who works with Daryl as well, so I'll reach out to him. He's a very interesting person.
Well, I worked with him regarding implants. If you like, I could.
Yeah, I know. Implants are, by the way, are real. Implants are real.
Yeah, I could send him a tickler and say, "Hey, respond to Ramirez."
Yeah. I think he knows of me. Because I did say that the two things that Lou Elizondo cannot say in any briefing, that he says they'll breathe down my neck if I say these things: implants and hybrids. You can't say those two words in association with anything to do with this phenomenon, but they're real. I'll tell you that. Yep. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
John, you could just pass Daryl's email on to John so he can reach out directly.
I'd be glad to.
Yeah, if you put it in the, if you know how to use the meeting chat, yeah, just put it there and I'll copy and paste it.
Or I think I have it too, but if you send it to me, John.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, I'll read. Yeah.
All right, I got your email, Jennifer. I'll send it to you, and
I can
all
forward.
right, good. I'm glad I can be helpful.
Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you very much.
Great questions. And
next.
Yes, Tom, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh,
There we go. Gotcha.
hi. I am. Can you hear me, anybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I lost the picture, but John, this is Tom Dannenhauer in Helena, Montana. And Jennifer, thanks so much. And John, it's nice to really enjoyed your talk, and it's nice to meet you. So thanks for sharing. But I wanted to ask you about the Aurora program. Did you ever know anything about that? My buddy and I, Keith Wolverton, when he was alive, used to talk about it. And it supposedly was an unmanned surveillance deal that went over Russia at 20,000 miles an hour.
I'm gonna separate myself from any performance characteristics or the name Aurora. I will separate myself from something that people think is the TR3B Black Mantra. And I tell people, separate yourself from the labels And just let's concentrate on what the function of that craft might be. So is there a, now I have to be very careful, is there a craft that performs the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance mission in the aerospace domain that exhibits extraordinary propulsion technology? You see how I'm mincing my words?
Sure.
Without saying the label. And I would say, yes, there is.
Yeah.
And
Thank you, John.
That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Because once you start using labels, you have to understand that DoD, they parse everything literally. So when you say, is there a TR-3B Black Manta? They can rightfully and truthfully say no, because they know it's called something else. But when you nail them on the function, is there a function like what I just described? And they're honest, they'll say, I can't talk about that.
Yeah.
And that's called a non-denial denial in Washington. It's like you just
Okay.
confirmed me without denying it. Just confirmed it. So I'll
Thank
do
you,
that
John,
for you. Sure thing.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Sure thing.
Perfect. Thank you for your question, Tom. We'll go on to Maggie. If you want to unmute yourself, please do.
Hi, John. Thank you so much. I consider myself still very new to this world with a lot to learn. So your information has been very helpful. But I can't help but wonder with the information that's being released, that it's really calculated bits of information released at various times, because I will say, like I'm sure everyone else here, wants to know absolutely everything right this minute.
Right.
But the majority of, just in the United States, the majority of people would lose their minds if they, or what's left of them, if they, you know, were given all this information as fact.
Right. Yes. And
Is it calculated release of information?
Maggie, thank you so much for that question. I've been saying this since I first entered into the public realm, that what you have been experiencing, at least since 2017, is what I call a controlled dissemination of information, control being the operative word. So you're right, it's not all at once, even though we want everything at once, it's not all at once. They are testing the waters by floating certain things. And the three things they floated back then was the fact that, you know, there's such a thing as the Tic Tac, Go Fast, and Gimbal craft that are not made by humans. They're not made by us, humans, not made by China, not made by Russia. Non-human made craft. And we want that message to be conveyed first and foremost, because then, in my mind, if you tell me that, oh, what's flying is not made by humans, my next question is, okay, if it's not humans, who? Who are they? Do you know who they are? Do you know why they are? Where do they come from? Why are they here? You know, that kind of questioning. So it's a controlled dissemination, as you say, a little bit by little bit by little bit. And Lou Elizondo, keep in mind, he was a counterintelligence officer. That means that he was an expert at finding out intelligence from others to be used by the US. So you're blocking the intelligence of others. So his job was to go out and, you know, suppress some information which we knew was wrong, because there are a lot of charlatans out there who claim to be CIA officers like me, who claim to be DIA officers like Lou, who are not. We know they're not, because all of us, and as Fred probably knows, all of us are in something called, on the civilian side, scattered castles, a database of everyone who holds a clearance, especially a top secret, sensitive compartmented information clearance, SCI, the highest level. And in the military side, it's called JPAS. And I forget what the acronym stands for, Joint Personnel something or other, JPAS. And if you're in those databases, they know what you've been read into and at what level you're cleared. And some of the folks that came out in the public and stood in front of UFO conferences were imposters. We know that. So we wanted to like suppress that information and then replace it with what we can, which is more truthful. And believe me, we we're tired of the American monopoly on the UFO question. I mean, absolutely. The goal of disclosure is not to let you know that there's something up in the air. That is the least important goal. The goal is to explain why they are here. They are here and why, and where did they come from, and what interactions that we humans have with them in ancient times. And the reason why they're here is, as I described in my briefing slides, nuclear. They're very concerned about our nuclear weapons capabilities, and they have demonstrated that they can shut them down. And so that's why they're here. They're also here because we have been the poorest stewards of their planet. And I say their planet because they've been here longer than we have. And we've poisoned the air and poisoned the water, and we just made a mess of the planet, right? I mean, climate change is a real thing. It's not a figment of anyone's imagination. It's a real thing. It's something CIA has analyzed and reported on to the policymakers. It's a real thing. So they're interested in our stewardship of the planet and want us to be better stewards of the planet. And when they show up, they're not going to take us over, but I hope they're here as teachers, helping us understand that, hey, we share this planet with you. By the way, your planet shares the solar system, and this part, we call it the Orion arm of the Milky Way galaxy. There's a lot of civilizations in there, in the Orion spur. You share it, we share it with you, you share it with us, and when you blow something up like that, we feel it. Stop doing that. And so that's why they're here, and that's why they interfere with the nuclear. That's why they appear at nuclear facilities. And that's why I would say this: the Department of Energy is the other agency that is closely associated with this UAP study by the government, because it's their facilities that are being visited constantly. So you're absolutely right. It's controlled, and we hope that people will be able to not go crazy over it, because they're going to hear a little bit at a time. And think of this. Something will happen between now and the end of the year. And a lot of things that you've been hearing from guys like Jim Van Me, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, the guys on the government side, people you read books about who were served in government as well, about their encounters and their knowledge. Maybe like Bob Jacobs, for example, who filmed the SM-65 Atlas being interfered with. Those kind of folks will be coming forward, I hope, and a major event. And it's going to be where hopefully there will be a former head of a major intelligence agency or a major department of the cabinet saying this is real and it's not human. And if they say that, can you imagine if I was a journalist and I was doing due diligence, I would take that microphone from the former and give it right in smack in front of the face of the current and say, Mr. or Ms. Secretary, your predecessor said this. What do you know about it? And can you imagine them in that position? They can't say, I don't know, because they look really stupid at that point. So we want this to be part of the American political discourse in the 2024 election process, so that it will not be laughed at by mainstream media journalists who are going to be conducting these primary campaign debates. That we want that question to be posed to each one of those, because the 2024 winner of the presidential campaign, that election is the disclosure president. So think about that when you make your choices. Who do you want to be the disclosure president? Because that person would be in that position to disclose everything, including like why, who are they? Why are they here? How long have they been here? Have we interacted with them in the past? Things like that. Thank you very much for your question. I love it.
Thank you. Oh, and I just want to say you made me smile when you spoke about why they are here and nuclear and how we're treating the planet.
That's
the other night. I watched one of my favorites, The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Oh, yes.
The original.
The 51. Yeah.
Michael Rennie. Yes.
Yep. That's a beautiful movie.
Absolutely. That was the message. And it's so funny that, it came out back in the 50s like that.
Yeah.
And people
51.
just thought it was just, a science fiction movie.
Right. So movie trivia, since you mentioned that, there were 2 UFO movies made after Roswell. The first one was called The Flying Saucer. And it was made with the cooperation of the United States government. In the front of that movie, it says, "We thank the authorities for making this movie. Without their assistance, this movie would not be made possible." Now, in the movie, The Flying Saucer, the plot line is that the saucer was in, of all places, Alaska, I think. Alaska, where they apparently shot something down, which they won't tell us what they shot down. And in the movie, it was revealed that it was an American engineered flying saucer. And this movie was released in, I think, 1950. That was the first UFO movie ever come out of Hollywood. The second one was The Earth Stood Still in 1951. In 52, the saucers appeared before DC in July of 52. And a CIA officer named Ed Taus, I knew his son, served alongside his son. Ed Taus was in charge of the disinformation program. And he said, "We're going to study this in secret, but out in public, we're going to deny. We're going to disparage witnesses who come forward. We're going to cover it all up. And Air Force, you're going to help us." That happened in 52. But the first 2 movies had more disclosure in it, including the original headline from the Roswell Daily Record. There's your disclosure. And now we're hearing more disclosure coming toward the end. And I'm excited that, that you'll greet January 1st, 2024 with a lot of this information out in the public domain. No more stigma. We want to erase all of the stigma. And eventually the end goal is to get the American government out of the UFO monopoly. We support the people in government who are pushing disclosure, support the actions of a little tiny principality, an independent country in Italy called San Marino, who put forth the Project Titan initiative for the United Nations. We fully support Project Titan, and we want the American government to release everything out into the public domain because the American government scientists are done with it. They can't push it any more than what they have done. And now it's time for more minds to look at the metamaterials and the craft and see what good can come out of it other than spy plane. So I'll go off my soapbox. I get very passionate about this. I get very passionate.
It's wonderful, John. I'm speechless and grateful because, people in MUFON or, people who haven't written books or had your career background can speak at a conference or, share some of this information, but it comes with far less credibility. So we've been asking for this for a long time. So I really appreciate your passion for disclosure. And I agree. I think the American public are really ready and want to know. So we have another question from Bob Terrio. So please unmute yourself, Bob.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Good to see you after a few days. I'm an old friend of Jennifer's, and we worked on Travis and a bunch of projects together. And I really enjoyed your talk tonight, John. This is fascinating stuff.
Thank you, Bob.
There are a couple things you talked about using infrared to study this phenomena.
Yes.
And a couple things that I've encountered were back in the early 90s. There was an airplane in Mexico that was chasing after drug cartels and things of that nature. And they encountered a flock of UFOs in the clouds that they saw on their infrared cameras. But when they visually looked outside the window, they couldn't see it.
Yeah.
They're showing up on infrared.
Right.
And I know back in at least 20 years ago, I heard that B&H Photo in New York, if anybody wanted to purchase a camera that had infrared capabilities, they had to sign a government document answering why they were buying the camera. And that was thought that was very interesting.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, you can get a Psionics. There's a company called Psionics that sells a infrared telescope that works in the 900, and I hate to be technical, but it works in the 980 nanometer range, which is right below, you can't see this red, but if you look through, you'd be amazed what's up in the skies. I went with Melinda Leslie in Sedona, Arizona. She out of the Center for the New Age, and she has the UFO sightings tour. with military goggles, and we went out, my wife and I and a bunch of other people. And sir, I saw what are satellites, but you know what a satellite doesn't do? It doesn't do this, this, or this. And they maneuver, and that would destroy a satellite doing that out in space. I mean, they don't maneuver. And I saw a lot of maneuvering objects, including 5 in a row that were not associated with Starlink at all. They're 5 in a row. So yeah, there's a lot of information about infrared in the annals of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. The original Senate legislation that got blended into the National Defense Authorization Act, theirs was called the Intelligence Authorization Act, and the IAA and the NDA got blended together, but it designated the Director of National Geospatial Intelligence Agency to be the lead agency to study the UAP phenomenon, because so much of it is not visible to the human eye, but they have all of the data. I know they do.
Wow.
I got one from real quick from Brenda, and I don't know when the craft were developed. I don't know if they're triangles, but I'll say this. When you talk about triangles to a person who knows about them, the first thing they will ask you, you're talking about ours or theirs? And that's what they'll say. And that's all I'm going to leave it at. The triangle craft, it's very aerodynamic. And you don't need a triangle to fly out in space, but you do need one to fly in aerospace in our atmosphere. So I don't know when it was seen, but many people have seen them. And I do believe they do exist. I just don't believe it's called the TR-3B. I don't know what it's called, but I don't think that's the name of it. But yeah, they do exist. 76 could be. If you saw it, you saw it, you know, so. All right, thank you, Brenda, for that. I got a question in the chat.
Yes, for those people listening, there was a question in the chat from Brenda, and John was smart enough to pick it up and see it. And he's very sophisticated with Zoom. I didn't have to mention there was a question, but you can go click on chat at the bottom of your Zoom and read the question, which John just answered from Brenda. So we have one more question from our Zoom group from John B. I invite you to unmute yourself and share your question, John.
Hey, I'm John from Nebraska FI, MUFON FI. I was also on a Rivet Joint and Combat Cent 23 years around the same time as Fred. I think he was there a little bit before me, but my question, you mentioned nuclear. I was reading a book by Colonel Corso, Day After Roswell. You're probably familiar with him. Many people are. And he mentions towards the end of his book that much of the nuclear arms race was a knee-jerk reaction, kind of misplaced, the governments and the Soviets to the threat of unknown craft. They didn't know what else to do. Never heard that before, but you think that's true? Plausible?
You know, I believe in Colonel Corso and what he says. Some of the technology was already like in progress by humans, by human scientists and engineers. But the important thing to remember that it wasn't perhaps the technology that actually started our utilization of it, not from the craft, but helped us get over the line that we then saw, oh, that's how it's done, and help us get over the line. As far as the nuclear part, there's a correlation between nuclear, very strong. And so, you know, you go back to the Trinity event that Jacques Vallée and Paula Harris have extensively researched that occurred in 1945, like when the implosion device, the device we dropped on Nagasaki, was the one that was tested in July 1945, the implosion device. When that occurred, you know, here comes the craft. So as far as having nuclear be an option, I would say that, you know, there were tests in space with nuclear weapons. We launched a live nuclear weapon up into space and exploded it. And so why was that done? You know, and some people say, well, that's just to test the EMP capabilities of it. But yeah, the nuclear part, I hope it gets fleshed out in the disclosure that's to come, because that is also central to what I said, like our stewardship of the planet, nuclear should not be in that equation of our
Right.
stewardship. And they're telling us that, we can shut you down. So, why bother doing it?
That was definitely their message more than once.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, John.
I have a question. Was that on, did we explode that nuclear weapon on the moon? I think we shot something to the moon.
We've been shooting things on the moon. I don't believe there's a nuclear explosion on the moon. I haven't heard that. You know what I have heard? And that there were seismic tests done on the moon where we did shoot something at it. It wasn't nuclear. And we had seismic sensors and the moon resonated like a bell. I mean, if it's a solid rock all the way through, it should not have resonated like a bell. And it did. And then we did that test twice.
Wow. Wow.
So
we have an
yeah.
additional question from John Birdie. So go ahead and unmute, John. And
Yeah, I'm thinking about what I call the space race between China, Russia, United States to get any kind of technological advantage they can from experiencers, from people that report something. I kind of think nothing will be disclosed of any real deep significance because it's so valuable to the military. I just wondered if you had some thoughts on that.
I do. Like I said, the military has exploited the technology to the full limits it can. And we don't have anti-gravity. We do have exotic propulsion systems, I would say that. But anti-gravity to the sense that, we can like warp drive over to the, next star system, that's not happening with our stuff we built, or the Russians or the Chinese. If there's anything like that, I would say that we hitch a ride with the visitors to do that. And there it goes to the secret space program. We're not picking ordinary citizens. We're picking like people who are trained to do that. And, the very ending of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, there was so much disclosure in there that it was amazing, because at the very ending, there's this exchange of folks, who were trained, ready to go, in uniform, ready to go on board the craft. And so I would say it's a hard question to answer. But I think that you will be surprised at what would be disclosed. You would be very surprised. And the more you're steeped into ufology, the least you accept disclosure. That's an ironic statement, because people steeped in ufology have grasped onto a certain hypothesis espoused by certain ufologists that they love and follow. And anything contrary to that, you're going to reject. And that ufologist will stand up and say, that's all BS. That's not true. They're lying to you because they didn't agree with my hypothesis. That's going to happen. We know that's going to happen. We absolutely know that's going to happen. And the only way we can cross that, to overcome that, is to release real data. We need to show what we have stored. We need to show the metamaterials. If the beings that are working with us, that's allegedly working with us, it's up to them to show themselves. We can't force them out saying, show yourselves. So it's up to them to do some major, like event to show themselves. And I don't think they're going to land on anybody's lawn, White House or otherwise. But I'm hoping for like, oh, look at the sky. They're like obliterating the sky. You can't even see the sun. There's so many of their craft there. That's what I'm hoping for. And I got in trouble for saying that the first instance of that could occur in 2027. I got pushback from my own home agency saying, you're not supposed to say that, which leads me to believe that, okay, there's something to that, isn't there? Yeah. The only pushback I got, two pushbacks I got, was the Nazi association with CIA and the UAP phenomenon, and the arrival of our visitor friends in 2027. They didn't like that.
I am amazed that you are able to say all that you can say.
Thank you, United States Congress, for passing the NDAA fiscal year 2023 that absolves all of us from any NDAs related to the non-human technology. which is why when I'm asked questions about triangles and stuff, I can't go there. I cannot honestly go there. But if you talk about anything that's external to that, I can talk about it now, thanks to that legislation. And because of that legislation, that's why I told Steve Bassett, you're absolutely right, Steve, months and not years, most of this will come out. The initial hurdle will come out, and it will be part of the political discourse in 2024, or should be, if it's not. And the 2024 president has the opportunity to be the disclosure president. So yeah, we can talk about it now. Before we couldn't talk about it, before we hinted at things and we, shadow puppets, but now we can actually show you and express to you what we know.
So I have a question.
Sure, Jennifer.
Did you just sort of imply, as well as chair, that people in the UFO community are aware of the potential for a false flag type of presentation, that people in the UFO community would be very suspicious, would not be?
I encourage people to be suspicious. Yes. The answer is yes. You should always be suspicious. I encourage people, do not believe anything I say, because you will be shown what I say in a very dramatic fashion in the months to come. So I encourage people to absolutely think of me as an imposter, spilling misinformation, disinformation, because I know for a fact that what I say is true. And not to say I told you so, but yeah, I told you so, that a lot of this information will be coming out. So yeah, people should be very cautious about what they hear out in the public domain and should question everything. That's why I say I embrace it all. I mean, I'll listen to anybody, but it doesn't mean I have to tightly agree with everything. I'll lightly agree with you. And if you don't pan out, I'll drop you.
Right.
So I encourage that, that's the best way to go about things.
Right. Well, I don't believe we have any other questions from the floor. If we do, please wave your hands if you're on camera so I can tell, or use your hand below where it says raise hand. If we don't have any other further questions.
I have one real quick. If humans engage, this is from Frankenmack. Okay. If humans engage in a nuclear war, would other beings prevent it? Yes. Yes, they already demonstrated that they can prevent it. They will not allow that to happen. I'm pretty sure of it.
Yeah, well, we can all say thank God to that, right? But of course, we run the risk of having other events like Fukushima and the explosion that happened in Chernobyl. Serious issues with earth changes and nuclear power plants. I think that's just as dramatic of a threat. Would you agree, John?
Yes, I would say a nuclear accident of that kind, in our country, it was 3 Mile Island. If you remember that occurred in Pennsylvania, didn't it?
Well, yes, it did.
Yeah, that's or Fukushima in Japan, and any of those incidents that will occur, it's a radiological incident. So it doesn't create a mushroom cloud. It's not a thermonuclear event, but boy, radiation is what kills you.
Yes.
The heat will vaporize you if you're close enough, but the radiation will spread out and kill you.
So we have a couple more questions.
Maggie.
And one that popped up from Maggie. So go ahead, Maggie.
On that note, why would they let incidents like Chernobyl happen? And if they would stop nuclear war, would it be in a peaceful way?
The peaceful way they can stop nuclear war is not allowing nuclear weapons to be detonated. They'll all be duds, and they've proven to us that they can make these nuclear weapons into duds so that they're no longer able to operate as weapons. So that's been proven many times.
Now, the nuclear power issue, Maggie, is a completely different one because we're, of course, using that for electricity. And it's actually probably, in some ways, it's a cleaner way for immediate environmental issues, but a long range it creates more serious.
There is something called fusion reactors. And what they're fusing is hydrogen and oxygen, water. And you fuse water under extreme magnetic forces, squeezing and compressing that water, imploding that water, it releases a tremendous amount of plasma. And you can tap into that plasma, and it's non-nuclear, non-radiological. And the major release of what happens, the residue, if you will, is water, steam, water. It's non-nuclear. And as soon as you stop it, it stops. No more fusion reaction. That's how the sun works. That's why the sun doesn't blow up. There's like zillions of thermonuclear bombs blowing up on the sun in a controlled fashion. But it's fusion. It's a fusion reactor, and they are building one in France.
Wow. So does that answer your questions, Maggie, about
Yes.
because like if there is an ET intelligence, you know, I don't know that they can prevent nuclear meltdowns, but they certainly can try to control them, possibly control the contamination. But once that's set in motion, it becomes very, very hard to control and contain.
They're like good parents that they don't like, they're not tyrants with their children. They allow the children to learn and to have free will. But when the children find a box of matches and start lighting them, which is my analogy of, you know, of playing with nuclear weapons, they will stop that, like a good parent should. But otherwise, you know, they want us to learn. They want to learn, want us to have free will. So that's never gone. I don't think they're controlling us so much as allowing us to experience things and making up our own minds.
So we have 2 more questions, one from Brenda and one from John. So I'll call on Brenda first. If you'd like to ask your question, you've raised.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. John, I would like to ask, there's something I read, I can't remember exactly what the source was, but you mentioned some things that triggered this, and that is that if there's going to be a demonstration of, you know, the phenomenon being real, that it might get faked somehow.
Yes.
And I'm trying to understand to what, you know, what would the goal of that be? I'm really confused by that. I've read that, and it's almost like, you know, they don't trust what you're seeing, which is what you're saying. But there might be some sort of staging of a disclosure in a way. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'll be happy to. I would say this, that there always is, I would say that you may have heard, how do I say this? You may have heard in a group called the Collins Elite. If you haven't, it's a group of influential people in the government, in the intelligence community, and in the Pentagon who wish to convince the world that the phenomenon is a manifestation of satanic demonic forces, and that they want to stage something like a fake alien invasion, as Dr. Greer would say, in order to scare people, to frighten people. And the technology exists. They don't even have to have craft to do it. They can do it electromagnetically by projecting in the skies what we would call orbs, but having them behave in very harmful ways. And so there's that. And how do you discern that? Part of this disclosure will involve religious leaders, people you trust. Religious leaders, it'll involve influential people who are not associated necessarily with the intelligence community or the Pentagon. We know that we need those people on board as well. And I believe they will come on board and you will see them. So we need that as well. And we just, at that point, need plausible demonstration of actual artifacts. We need to show you. Let's bring it out of the storage facility, you know, underground or in the mountain somewhere. Here's the craft, and here's the materials, and you know, Mr. and Ms. Scientists who's not in the government have at it. Have at it, and then you know that's not staged because it's real. It's a real thing, unless it's accompanied by real artifacts. You don't know. The other thing we hope to do is to get other governments involved, because the Five Eyes, that is Canada, Australia, UK, and New Zealand, also have data and materials. Latin America, there's a tremendous amount of materials in Latin America. And you've heard about the Brazil case that James Fox made a brilliant movie about the Virginia episode where beings were actually seen by the people. And apparently there were like, some of them were injured and some of them were dead, and they took it away with the craft. We need to show that that really happened, that that's a real thing. So we need to go back in history and saying, okay, you've heard about this incident, that's real. You heard about that incident, that's real. It's all real. And for those who are coming forward, the way that they vetted people coming forward is that they look up their clearances, they look up their work experience, they looked up their career service files, and they knew that what they said or what they're saying is a real thing, because they can go back and pull off without any redaction the document. So that's what they did. They went back and say, oh, this individual said this. This is the experience that he or she had. And it's not just all like physical experiences. There are a lot of experiencers in government, a lot of experiencers. And they said, yeah, what they experienced, we have data for. So everyone is vetted. And I've said this before, outside of a UFO conference, the most experiences I've ever encountered in one place has been inside CIA. And Jim Simivan, I shared my experiences with Jim, and he said, I'm not ready to share mine. More recently, he shared about the robed figures who entered into his bedroom and with his wife present. And he said, yep, there are these robed figures, and they entered in my bedroom and they went through the wall. And oh, by the way, my wife has an implant and I have an implant and mine was removed. That's Jim Simivan, CIA officer, saying that. Did he make that up? No, because I know I have an implant as well. So implants are real, like I said, and that might be later in the conversation. Right now, they're just talking about what's in the sky. And that will lead to conversations about why they're here and so forth and so on. Be very discerning. Be very discerning.
Yeah,
Yes.
makes a lot of sense. We should all, say prove it. I mean, so after so many years
Yeah.
of denying, it
Yep.
really warrants the question. Okay, now you've got a big change of tune. You need to prove it. And
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda.
Yeah, I just have in light of the conversations that have just taken place in your most recent statements, it's probably hard to discern, even for someone like Jim Semivan, if the robed figures are not from some Collins elite group or.
Yeah, I don't think humans can go through walls.
Let's hope.
Yeah, and his experiences have been very profound, and he took a chance sharing them. He was much senior than I was, and I know what he did for CIA, which I can't reveal, but it is related to our discussion. And so he took a big chance. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of folks who you've seen on YouTube videos with podcasters who've had experiences that won't talk about them, who are associated either currently or formerly with the U.S. government.
Do you believe and think that the former SIR program that went on at Stanford is still sort of in existence?
SRI, yeah, the Stanford Research Institute. Stanford Research Institute has been one of the foremost research institutes and with assistance to the U.S. government. We go way back. Stanford, MIT is another, and this is academic centers of excellence. And of course, we have Gary Nolan at Stanford University. You should pay attention to Gary. He's well informed. I would say that I would take what he says to the bank, pretty much.
We We just
Yeah.
interviewed him in, we have him in the newest film that Ron James,
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
I assisted him. It's called Accidental Truth, and he
Yeah.
actually
Excellent.
coined that phrase, Gary Nolan, in interviews that Ron did with him.
Mhm.
He kind of admitted, well, there have been some accidental truths.
Yep. Yep. They're not going to be accidents anymore. They're going to be, we're just spilling everything we can.
Right.
You'll be surprised what you'll hear. Stay tuned.
Yeah. So we do have another question from the floor from John. So go ahead, John, please unmute.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you about dozens of things. You are such a fascinating person, but I was originally going to ask about I've talked to hundreds of experiencers over the years, and there's always the manipulations of space and time and
Yes.
the screen memories. And
Yep. Yep.
I've talked to people who talk about all the people around them have
Mhm.
been like paralyzed or given a screen memory. I wonder how far that phenomena can go.
Yeah.
Could they give a screen memory to an entire village, an entire town, an entire planet, perhaps? I don't know if you want to comment on that, or you did mention Brazil, and I'm working with a Dr. Navarro who's done some very interesting studies, I think quite scientific, on experiencers, and I'd like to pass his paper on to Jennifer. Maybe she can
Sure.
send it to you. And
Yeah. I can address screen memory. So
but
I
but
had
regarding
one.
walking through walls too, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I really wonder about Project Stargate. I mean, it was shut down in the 80s.
Oh no, it's never shut down.
No, I don't think it was either.
Yeah.
I used to work for the military. I
Yeah.
know there's black money, and I understand it might be SAIC that has taken that over, maybe. But
Mhm.
what have they additionally been
Yeah.
able to accomplish in the last
Right.
40
Yeah.
years?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I thrown a bunch of topics at you, whatever you'd
Oh my
like to
gosh, I
address.
don't know where to go with that. Going back to screen memories, I've had screen memories presented to me, and I've talked about my screen memories with encounters that I had since I was 6 years old. That's a screen memory. I know it was. But as far as ongoing projects, anybody who's worked in the federal government knows it's easy to create a program, but it's really hard to shut down. Once it goes, it just stays, and it just changes names or changes offices, and they like play dodgeball, try to hit me now. And the remote viewing program is still ongoing. It was outsourced. And we have, like the Monroe Institute, we have the Farsight Institute, and we have Dr. Paul Smith's company as well. I think he's in Utah, if not Montana. I forget where he's at. But we've outsourced the remote viewing program out to them, and it's still a viable source of intelligence. I don't know if we can make policy decisions based on it, but it certainly augments the intelligence that we do collect by other means. As far as like going through walls and whatnot, sure, that could be a screen memory too. That entire encounter could be a screen memory, but Jim Singleton swears up and down that he was awake. And I had encounters where I was awake, and others where it seemed like a dream, but others I was wide awake and communicated with these beings as part of my experiences. And so, I would say this, UFO Twitter, you all familiar with that? I left UFO Twitter because I thought it was just insane place to be to discuss this seriously. But there is a equivalent of UFO Twitter within the Office of Director of National Intelligence. And within that SharePoint database, Averill Haines, the DNI, has enabled the collection of information from her workforce, the entire intelligence community, sharing it at a top secret SCI level. And there have been experiencers that have shared their experiences in this database, have shared their encounters with non-human beings in this, and they're taken seriously. So that's that. And the folks have been shutting it down. They're trying to shut it down, Air Force. And in the debrief, Chris Mellon wrote a wonderful piece shining that light, glaring light on the Air Force and what they've been doing of shutting everything down. They go through that and they intimidate people who are Air Force employees, Air Force uniformed service members, or Air Force contractors. And so there's that force against that. And so, yeah, I believe if experiencers, and that we can't ignore them. And there have been experiences by the folks who will be coming forward officially, who will recount their experiences. And some of them you've heard already. They're out in the public domain. If you look up on YouTube, you'll see what they shared. But this is going to be official now. Because
I do think that, I mean, it's all well and good to look into the lights in the sky sightings, but if you want to know why they're here, how they got here, what they're doing here, why not ask somebody who's been on board? That's the best source of information, I think.
Yeah, and that goes to Barbara Cobb's question as well. A very pertinent question, what are they going to say is going on to be disputed by the Collins elite? That faction of the Pentagon has lost its power. It's losing its power rapidly. And you can almost, for me, I can almost hear and feel the scraping of their claws against the wall as they lose their grip. And they know it's done. They know it's done, it's over, and they're going to step out of the way, because you will be surprised who will come forward and confirm that there are non-human beings flying these craft, and we know it. That's never been said before. What's been said is, oh, we don't know who they are, what they are, they could be Chinese, they could be adversarial, maybe not. You get like nothing. You get Jell-O, and we want to give you a nice big fat chocolate cake with all the icing on it, and you're going to get something that you can bite into instead of this Jell-O, and that's going to be coming forward. And we're living in exciting times. We really are.
Yes.
And the hearings tomorrow should be really quite interesting.
Interesting, but I don't expect much coming out of Mr. Kirkpatrick's testimony. For disclosure, I was given the means to contact him directly by from a very high level of government, saying, here, if you want to chat with Sean, here's how you contact him. And I refused. I just don't want to go there. People will hear later, and when all of this comes out before the end of the year, people will hear, and they don't need to hear from me anymore. I hope to really retire and not ever do this again. So I don't need to. I won't need to. After a while, I think it's up to you guys to carry the ball. We're passing the baton. We'll confirm everything you suspect, and you guys, you can go forward as MUFON. You can go forward and finish the race for us. Because it really needs to be in the civilian sector, the citizen sector, and get the government out of it.
Wow. Thank you so much for everything you have shared and all the breadcrumbs you have dropped for us this evening. This has been an unexpected and very dynamic revelation for many of us tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm sure this will be rewatched hundreds of times with people note-taking. So thank you so much, John.
Sure. And Jennifer, I'd be happy to entertain any further questions and however means that you have to communicate with mainline MUFON. I'd be happy to,
Well, I will
to answer questions through you. Yeah.
Thank you. I will invite them via email and pass them on to you, and then you can get back to people directly. That's very kind of you. I wouldn't even expect that, but
oh yeah, I mean, you guys paid my salary already. I mean, I'm doing this gratis because I was on the taxpayers' payroll, right? I mean, you guys pay taxes, you paid my salary, and you're still paying my retirement, right? So I mean, I'm working for you. All of us work for you. And so that's why we're doing it. So labor of love, because, we've seen what potential this could have on humanity as a whole, of bringing us back to where we should have been had not certain events in history have taken place. And I won't go through all that because there've been many prophecies of, in the past of what happened and so forth and so on. And, it's like now is the time where they're going to come back. The ancients knew more about what was going on than we do. And they wrote about it, but they wrote about it in a way that we look at as myths and legends. But I look at it as like history. I read it as history. And so they're coming back, I think, I hope, and to greet us again as rightfully we are their children. I firmly believe that. And so I have high hopes. And thank you so much, Jennifer, for providing this.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to hit end record so we can end our recording. We have claps coming from everywhere, from everyone. So I know everyone really, really appreciated this program. And once it's done, I will send you the link, John, so you can use it in any way you would like, but we will just post it for people who missed the program at Mainline MUFON.
Oh, I appreciate it very much, Jennifer. Thank you again.
Thank you. Okay, I'll say good night to everyone, and great to see you all. And John Birdies, I do not believe you are on our email list. I just shot you an email because I knew you'd like this program. But if you want to join, you can sign yourself up at mainlinemufon.com. It just says get monthly reminders. So if anyone else who's part of Mainline MUFON wants to share programs like this with your friends, just ask them to sign up directly, because constant contact requires me to do that ethically. So you have the right to get an email or not get an email. You sign yourself up. So thank you and good night. And we'll see you in a month. Okay. Bye.
Yep. God bless you all.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks, Jennifer.
You're so
Good
welcome.
night.
Very
God
welcome.
bless.
Okay.
Y'all
Ciao.
take care.